Hi there everyone, it's Russell. Welcome to the Reading Fabricator, and today I'm going to talk about a piece of non-fiction work by an author that I admire quite a lot, and is an author that got me back into reading about 6 years ago when I read 4 of his major works in a row within the space of a month, that being The Old Man and the Sea, Farewell to Arms, The Sun Also Rises, and For Whom the Bell Tolls. And that is A Moveable Feast, this wonderful vintage edition here. In fact, all the books I had by Hemingway are vintage editions. And it doesn't disappoint. I really enjoyed this. In fact, when I finished reading it, I thought to myself, it would have been good to actually read A Moveable Feast first and then move chronologically through his bibliography, because this takes place in the 20s, when just as he left being a journalist and was starting out as a writer, a short story writer, before he finished writing The Sun Also Rises, which is detailed towards the latter quarter of this book, and in particular all the days that he spent with his wife Hadley, their young son, and their cat F-Puss, living in basically what is referred to as the Quarter in Paris, which is a very poor community. It details his life as a struggling artist, so to speak. They were extremely poor. They had no money, no wealth. And in a way, this book here, what it really is, it is a love letter to Paris on behalf of Hemingway. It is him expressing his affection for the city. And it really comes through in this. And not just the city itself, but giving details on his own life. I mean, there are things that he writes about in this book that I just did not know about from my countless hours of research that I've done into this really interesting, somewhat controversial human being. I mean, people generally either like his work or loathe his work, and especially as a human being, he can come across as a bit, I don't know if misogynist is the right word, but people have had a go at him at times. I'm quite an admirer of his work, and I think he's been an influential part of the 20th century in terms of English letters. While this is technically written as sort of an autobiography, in fact, it wasn't actually finished. He was almost done with it when he died, so really it's just a collection of manuscripts tossed together to form this piece of work. Don't approach it as an autobiography, rather approach it as a series of vignettes of certain moments in his life during his time in Paris. That's the way to approach this book, and by doing so, you will get an insight into this man, into his writing prospects, and into a lot of adventures that he's had in Paris. That some are saddening, and some are just downright hilarious, including his interactions with F. Scott Fitzgerald. And those are the sections that I actually really adhered to. There's interactions with Gertrude Stein. He talks a lot about Gertrude Stein. She appears in the first half of the book, and then the latter half of the book is to do with F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda. And in between that is all these talks of him just walking around, just going to various cafes. He'd sit down, he'd go to his favorite cafe, sit down, order a drink, and he'd start writing. And in between writing, he'd look up and just look at various customers or people that are there and just wonder about them, and then continue writing. And sometimes he'd be there a whole afternoon just writing a paragraph, and whilst doing that, he'd look up at certain characters, certain individuals, and he'd focus only on them. And sometimes when he finished a paragraph, he'd look up and they're gone, and he'd wonder about them. It's really fascinating stuff, actually. He'd go for long walks along the Seine River and just talk about all these various landmarks. The Louvre gets mentioned quite a lot, and a lot of other locations that I won't dare pronounce on video because I just don't think I can get the French pronunciation right, but it's there. It's there. So he paints the picture for you. He paints Paris for you. You're able to visualize it in your mind. And all of it culminates in what I consider to be a very pleasant read, a very different take on his writing that I've not come across before, and including in some of the lesser works of his, such as To Have and Have Not, or even Across the River and Into the Trees, which I was not a fan of either. In fact, I wasn't a fan of both of them. To Have and Have Not, I still think is a really bad book. But it really gives you a sense of his enjoyment and wonder of being in this marvelous city, away as an expatriate, basically. I mean, he spent quite a lot of time in the 20s, just living with his family and just going about various day-to-day activities. The passages with Gertrude Stein are interesting, although I must admit I know next to nothing about her, so I can't really say much more. He goes to her apartment sometimes and we'll see various painters and just all these things, and a shitload of drinking. I mean, if there's one thing I took away from this book, is that they drank a lot. There's so much drinking in this 180-page book that it's insane. In fact, I started rereading The Sun Also Rises because I think it's a good companion piece to this book, considering that The Sun Also Rises, he talks about finishing it at the end of this book, so it's a good segue. And even with all the drinking in The Sun Also Rises, I still think there's more in A Movable Feast. I mean, there are so many situations and vignettes, basically events that take place at cafes with him drinking with various people. There's a very short encounter with James Joyce, very, very brief. I was expecting more of him, but unfortunately we don't get that, even though there's a couple of other times where Hemingway is walking and he sees Joyce and his family having a meal and he just gazes at them. But the true highlight for me of this book is his interactions with F. Scott Fitzgerald, which entirely take place in the second half of this book. When he first meets F. Scott Fitzgerald, he doesn't think much of him. I mean, he kind of likes him. He wasn't aware of his work. He was aware that he was probably a good short story writer, and he'd not yet read The Great Gatsby. But they decide to go on a trip together. They go on a trip, the two of them, down south, across the border into Spain. And it's a disaster from the get-go. I mean, Hemingway is unable to reach F. Scott Fitzgerald, and so he doesn't know what's going on. They catch different trains. Eventually, they end up at the same hotel. And this is where I consider this whole thing to be a comedic set piece. F. Scott Fitzgerald shows up. He's completely dazzled. He's very talkative. And he ends up having a few drinks, just a few, and he ends up in bed and he's complaining a lot. He thinks, oh, he's going to die of a disease, and he keeps complaining and asking Hemingway, oh, can you go get a thermometer? I think I'm going to die. And Hemingway is just about to lose it. He never actually gets angry, but you could see him just really, really just getting a bit edgy with Fitzgerald. And so he keeps on calling this waiter back and forth with whiskey sours and all these other drinks and paying him, saying, can you go get a thermometer? Eventually he does come back with a thermometer, but it ends up being a bath thermometer. And Fitzgerald is complaining about that as well, and Hemingway's saying, oh, we'll be glad it's not a rectal thermometer, and begins taking his temperature, saying it's, a certain number of degrees, and Fitzgerald's like, well, is that good? So Hemingway tests it on himself, and it turns out it's the exact same number, so he says, well, it must be good because I feel fine. What you get from this entire interaction is just how much of a snobby gentleman Fitzgerald is compared to Hemingway. I mean, these are two such mismatched individuals. It's basically the very definition of the odd couple. And it takes place in this chapter, which is the longest chapter in the book. It's about 20-ish pages, but it flew by quite quickly. All the other chapters range from, 5 pages or so, but this one was quite a lengthy piece, and I was glad that it was that long because it really, really gives you an insight into what really is the beginning of a brilliant friendship between these two. A friendship that had highs and lows, in particular to do with F. Scott Fitzgerald and his drunkenness. He'd get drunk quite a lot, and it was only when he was sober that he'd go on these lovely walks with Hemingway and discuss all sorts of things. But then the next chapter is when Fitzgerald invites the Hemingway family over for dinner, and it turns out to be a disastrous dinner. I mean, the meal is awful. They have to resort to drinking lots of wine to be able to get the meal down. But the problem, the meal, was his wife, Zelda, who at the time, I mean, nobody knew, but at the time she was severely mentally ill. And she'd just come back from all these parties, and she'd always degrade Scott a lot. And it's a really, really piercing insight into the relationship between F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife, Zelda. And you can see that they're having all sorts of problems. But even though they're having all sorts of problems, Fitzgerald will always confide in Hemingway that I love her, I'll never leave her. It's a really toxic relationship, so to speak. And it's all told from the point of view of Hemingway. I mean, this is Hemingway right in this book 30 years after it happened. So, I mean, these are all his recollections. Think of it as like just a fuzzy memory, and he's only able to take pieces of it and able to accumulate some form of wording. And so you can only really guesstimate as to how much of this really is true. I like to think that the whole thing that happens in this book is true. It's a truly wonderful piece of work, but then it gets better and better. I mean, the first half was okay, but the second half, from F. Scott Fitzgerald all the way to the end, in my mind, is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And had he not shot himself and continued to finish this book and probably write more pieces, I think the book would have gotten better and better as a piece of vignette memoir. There's a whole section, the final chapter, in fact, that is dedicated to them going up into, I'm not sure if it's the Alps, I think it's the Austrian Alps, maybe not, but it's certainly up in the mountains, and they're going skiing. And it's during his time in the skiing in the winter season when he pushes out most of the writing for The Sun Also Rises. And he's talking about how all the other British people just refused to go there. He's talking about all these avalanches that happen, and that him and Hadley would go and ski down these slopes that no one else would attempt. They'd had this dog that was with them, and he'd let the dog ride on his back while skiing down the slopes. And it's all quite good until we get to the final page. Now I'm going to read it to you because I don't think it's a spoiler. I mean, this is an autobiography, so there's no real plot spoilers, so to speak, but I think it really sums up the book quite a lot and is quite brilliant. So I'm going to read it to you now. I loved her and I loved no one else, and we had a lovely magic time when we were alone. I worked well and we made great trips, and I thought we were invulnerable again. And it wasn't until we were out of the mountains in late spring and back in Paris that the other things started again. That was the end of the first part of Paris. Paris was never to be the same again, although it was always Paris, and you changed as it changed. We never went back to the Volberg, and neither did the rich. There is never any ending to Paris, and the memory of each person who has lived in it differs from that of any other. We always return to it no matter who we were or how it was changed, or with what difficulties or ease it could be reached. Paris was always worth it, and you could return, and you received return for whatever you brought to it. But this is how Paris was in the early days when we were very poor and very happy. I thought that was quite beautiful, and it speaks to my theory and philosophy that I think Hemingway can write a great ending to any book, including even non-fiction. I think a Moveable Feast was the very definition of a pleasant read. Gives you an insight into the man. For those who are haters of his fiction, then give this a go. See what you think of A Moveable Feast. I know I liked it, and probably you will too. Even if you haven't read it and have read other things by him, even his short story collections, I do recommend it. I think it's a good piece of work. I just wish that he stayed alive longer and added more to it, so that I can get even more insight into his creative process and leading up to and including the publication of The Sun Also Rises. It would have been a really fascinating journey to go with him along with that, but we have what we have, and I maintain that it's good. Thank you very much for watching, and see you on the next one. Bye.